Well, hello and welcome to this week's A Photographic Life, and of course the conversation in which I talk with my transatlantic friend Bill Shapiro about photography and a number of things surrounding photography, around the medium. This episode, we're responding to you, the listener. One of you sent in a question and we've responded to it. I hope you enjoy our response. And of course, as always, if you want to find out about me or Bill, just go on to the website at unitednationsofphotography.com and you'll get all the information you need. Now, let's hear some conversation, shall we?
Good morning, Grant. Hope you're doing well.
I'm good, thank you. And I hope you're well also in a slightly more positive America.
It's been really kind of like being in a blender or a washing machine over here. I mean, the ups and downs and the spin has been unbelievable, but I'm feeling better than I was, exactly a week ago.
Well, I suppose in a way it fits perfectly into what we're talking about this time. That idea of the ongoing story, isn't it? I mean, what a narrative we're living through.
Yeah. And I think, hopefully we'll talk about single pictures versus stories. And, if we do want to talk about single pictures capturing a story, there are two from the assassination attempt on Trump that tell wildly different stories. Of course, one with his fist in the air and one with his face on the ground cowering. Just the choice of those single images by whoever chose to run them and the story they wanted to tell with those images is pretty interesting.
It is, isn't it? The context of usage can change everything.
Yeah. And those pictures, of course, were taken, within seconds of each other, and they show a whole different story.
Yeah, who knows? By the time this podcast actually airs, maybe we'll know the truth.
Yes.
Anyway,
and there'll be lots of conspiracies doubting it, but yes.
Well, I've seen many already. So listen, I know there was a question that you received from one of our listeners, and it was the impetus for the discussion this month. So do you want to kick us off with that question?
Yeah, I do. The episode idea came from a listener over Instagram. His name is Chris Dempsey, and his Instagram handle is Wouldn't It Be Cool? He wrote to me and said this: 90% of my work I don't feel has a story to it because I didn't go into it with a story in mind. I just had a visual idea that I was trying to achieve. Then after the fact, I might see a story and may be able to make one up, or someone else might see a story and let me know. Because I might describe what I do as fashion-leaning creative portraiture, I always want to be telling a story. But at the same time, I'm so visually driven, I use that to drive my process, that I might have a great visual in my head and then simply make up a story to support it. And then he asked, does it matter more to have a story first and tell it visually, or to create an image and see how many stories you can tell from it? Yeah. And so I thought this was interesting for a few reasons. One, we can speak to his question, which I think is interesting, but also, in my sort of practice, helping photographers make books and with their portfolios and whatnot, a lot of people are coming to me now, younger photographers, and asking the question, why do I need to be good at telling stories? Isn't a single image enough? Why the emphasis on storytelling? Is it important? How important is it? And if so, how do I get started doing it? And so I thought all of those questions might be good for us to talk about.
I agree. It's certainly going to be more than one episode, that's for sure. I mean, when you put this to me, I have to admit I was slightly not jaded, but I've written so much about this very thing over the years. And in fact, I even went back to a book I wrote in 2015 called The New Global Landscape Explained, Professional Photography, The New Global Landscape Explained, because there was a whole chapter in there that deals with this. But also, one of the reasons I write about it so much and I talk about it so much is because I think it's probably one of the most difficult things anybody can do as a photographer. And I actually think it's the one thing that defines a photographer from somebody who takes photographs.
Say more about that.
In a sense, I suppose anyone can take individual images. Camera equipment now is allows us to do that. Your phone allows us to do that. It allows us to override all of the technical details, and you might get lucky with a specific image. The reality of taking a specific image means that you can be much harsher on your images in the editing process in choosing which images work and which don't. And however, if you're going to work as a photographer, if you're going to be a professional photographer, there's sort of two things I think you need to do. One is you need to be able to tell stories. And the second thing is you have to be consistent. So you have to be able to do it every time that somebody asks you to do it. There isn't an opportunity to just say, it didn't work. You know, it has to work if you're going to work as a professional photographer. But the telling of the story, let's take fashion as an example. Every single fashion story has to have a narrative. That narrative would be led by the clothes. You might be a food photographer doing some pictures around chocolate cakes. Well, the chocolate cake becomes the story. So the really key thing is not to think about storytelling as being documentary or journalism in that kind of narrow magnum way. So this, to me, is why it's so important to be able to do it. If it was easy, everybody would be a photographer.
I want to talk to you about chocolate cake. I think it would be extremely helpful if you could describe how, let's just say in a magazine or a site, there are 5 pictures of chocolate cake for a food story. Tell us how that becomes a story rather than a series of pictures about chocolate cakes.
Because what would happen is that if you were going to make those images, they have to work together. So there would be an aesthetic decision, there would be styling decisions, there would be decisions as to how you're going to approach the cake, what kinds of people are going to buy the cake, where the context of where those images are going to sit. You can't just take 6 great pictures of chocolate cake, stick them together and think they're going to look great. They're not. Each image has to consider the other.
But let me, I'm glad we're talking about this. I want to, maybe this is a question of semantics, but when I think of the word story, I think of a beginning, a middle, and an end, a story arc. Is what you're describing with chocolate cake less of a story and more of a series? And is there a difference?
No, I think it's a story, but it's a short story. And I think this is where, for me, I mean, whenever I'm teaching storytelling in photography, I always begin in the same place. I begin with music, and I start to talk about storytelling in song lyrics. And then I'll look at the idea of a poem, and then I'll look at the idea of a short story and then a novel, because it's all storytelling, but it all has different kind of elements that come together to make the story. But it's all storytelling.
Well, if we talk about music or we talk about a short story, again, there's an intro, there might be a chorus, and there might be some kind of a big finish. With a chocolate cake, that is possible. You could end the story in the magazine or publication, with a big splash or the, piece de resistance. But some of that is up to the photo editor or the designer more than the photographer.
No, because if the photographer doesn't make the work, those other 2 people have got nothing to work with. So if you're doing, I mean, we've got it in this food thing. I mean, because I used to art direct food photography as well as other things. But the reality is you would have an establishing picture, which would be your introduction, and that might be a series of the cakes together. And then you would photograph close-ups of the cake, and you might have an overall aerial shot of the cake, and you might look at the decoration of the cake. So you would be telling a story of those cakes in which to try and engage the viewer to make them. and to engage with that story or to read that article, in that particular example. But if you look at it from a fashion perspective, for example, the fashion story will always begin with the clothes. So though it may be, let's say, brightly colored scarves. So you're going to have 6, 8, 10 images of brightly colored scarves. Then you would start to think, okay, what are our reference points? Where was our location? How are we going to tell this story? So the idea of storytelling needs to be seen, I think, in a much bigger, kind of more open, democratic way than thinking about it too literally.
We wanted to sort of push to define that, and I, although I was sort of taking a devil's advocate point of view, I totally agree.
I'm glad you did, because that's usually my role.
Right. When I was at Life, these stories, in addition to traditional, Magnum style documentary pictures, stories, we would do these, what I would call concept stories, where one time we went into Times Square, and we had a beautiful wooden bowl, and we approached strangers and asked them to empty their pockets and put the contents of their pockets in this bowl, which they would hold with their hands. And so you'd see a kid's hands and everything that was in his pocket, on 42nd Street. And then you'd see a working person's hands and everything that was in their pocket. And it was a series of still lifes with no establishing shots. But to me, that really told a story.
Yeah, it's like a little haiku or a poem, isn't it?
Exactly. So,
that's for me is how it works.
So then we were going to go back to this initial question that Chris Dempsey asked for his fashion-leaning pictures. He goes into it with a strong visual in mind, but not necessarily a story. And then it sounds like he tries to retrofit a story onto his pictures. Tell me what you think of that.
I think it's a mistake. You can go into photography and have a really strong idea about what that photograph is going to look like. But the chances are that unless you're really controlling it and kind of killing any element of spontaneity it may have, it's never going to end up really how you thought. For me, when you said this to me, previously about this question, the first thing I thought was that the way in which you have to tell a story is, first of all, you have to do your research, and you have to think about that story in two different ways. And in the book, I was just saying to you about the new global landscape, I wrote about the idea of having two specific types of story. One is the emotional, and the other is the intellectual. The emotional comes from within, and the intellectual comes from a place of inquiry. I think what they both require, and if you're going to make work as a writer or a musician or anybody would, you have to do your research before you take any pictures. And I don't mean that as research in a dull academic way, although it may require reading, looking at photographers' work, looking at people who've made work around a similar kind of story. But it's also the research of living life, of going for a meal, of meeting people and having conversations. Without that research, I don't think you have the base understanding required to then create a story.
I don't know if I'm kind of reading into this, but I do get the sense from the people who I speak with that because of the way that Instagram focuses on single images rather than narrative stories, the coin of the realm for Instagram is the single image. I feel like there's more emphasis from younger photographers on that practice, on making, the single beautiful image. And I think it's worth saying, in all of the with all the photo editors I've spoken with over the years about specifically how do you make a good impression when you show your portfolio to a photo editor of any kind, what they want to see is a story. They want to see how pictures fit together. They want to see how, if you can sustain interest in a topic over a series of moments, if there's an emotional arc, if there's a visual arc.
I'm sure you've spoken to some people, Bill, haven't you? That's enough of me going on about this. What are your findings?
Yeah, I spoke with a couple people, excuse me, about this. And the first one is Kate Dingley. She is a terrific photographer based not too far from me in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In 2017, Time magazine listed her as one of 34 female photographers to follow. Her first monograph was called Easy Riders, and it's about New York City's Black Motorcycle Club. It was published in 2022. And for that story and for that book, she spent 5 years with the riders. She shoots for the Times, New York Times Magazine, Bloomberg Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. So I asked Kate what she looks for in a story. What are the ingredients that make her say, like, yes, this is a place where I want to spend time? And it's worth saying that Kate is a documentary storytelling photographer. But she says one crucial ingredient to the long-term story is surprise, where I learn that my preconceptions are wrong, or that a person or group of people have a lot more going on than meets the eye. Another critical piece is that the story must be photogenic. It sounds ridiculously obvious, and I'm sure there are plenty of photographers who'd argue that everything is photogenic if you have the skill to photograph it, but I strongly disagree. And then she talks about her one project that she did called Exotic Bodies in Motion. And she says, I'll take this as an example. I lived a couple towns over from this rural strip club, and it was locally infamous. The stories I heard about it were just so unbelievably bad that I knew they couldn't all be true, and I had to get inside and see for myself. In a strip club, there are lots of visual costumes and props, and long-term dancers who were there throughout my project, and also plenty of women who were hired and then quit. So there was both consistency and the ability to build strong relationships, while there's also a lot happening all the time. And finally, there's a constant tension between fantasy on stage and out in the club, and reality backstage. I love the contradiction and paradox and seeing how we reconcile it.
Yeah, I mean, that completely fits into what I was saying there about the idea of intellectual storytelling, that sense of instigation. But also, I think she makes a really good point there, which was something I wanted to talk about, which is it needs to be photographable. I have so many people sort of saying, I'm going to do this. And I'm like, it's a great idea, but what are you going to photograph? And I think that's a really, really key point she makes.
Yeah, and I think the fact that she's thinking about the different dynamics at play, like obviously there's front of house and back of house for these dancers. This lends itself to a very complex way of storytelling, and it gives you a chance to look at something in a handful of different ways and follow a story from a handful of different perspectives. And I think that's one element that makes a great story.
It does, but we can imagine that as a book as well, can't we?
Yes.
And that's the key. If you can't imagine it as a book, or I quite often say to people, well, has somebody else done this before? And if they haven't, there's probably a good reason why they haven't, because it can't be done.
Right. The next question I asked Kate was how she finds her stories. And I asked this because a lot of younger photographers have asked me about that very question. How do I find stories? And I think it's interesting because I feel like a lot of young or new photographers today are focused on identity. And we've talked about this some degree. And often that identity is their own. And they tend to look at themselves and their experience and their emotions rather than looking outward, and need some help with respect to what to look for in a story and how to approach a story outside of themselves. So Kate responded to that and said, you hit the nail on the head with this question. I agree with you. The young photographers are focused on self-identity. And I've also been frequently asked, how do you come up with ideas of what to photograph? I wonder if it's or photography school or social media or something else that's encouraging new photographers to go in this direction to the exclusion of all else. It's no wonder that they can't come up with stories, though, if they're always feeling like they have to look inward. Photography, for me, is not an exploration of my life or my identity. I'm a photographer because I'm fascinated with other people, and photography is a bridge between us and how I can begin to understand them. Some stories happen through chance, and some I research and seek out. I read a lot. I've even gotten one project idea from a murder mystery novel. I look at paintings and films for new ideas too, and keep a notebook with lists of things to research further. I actually find that looking at too much still photography can cloud my thinking. So Grant, I'm curious what you think of that and where your story ideas come from.
I agree with everything she's just said, and I'm quite happy for her to come and teach on my the course I run.
I'm sure she would be interested in talking about it.
Because I completely agree, and one of the problems now is people don't read enough, and you've got to read. And I was just watching. I think there's two really interesting things recently. I was just watching the Wes Anderson film, The French Dispatch, which is the most beautifully photographed film that I've seen for years. It's so much you can't really watch it in one go. And there was also that, and it's just gone right out of my head, the black and white Netflix series.
Ripley.
Yeah, exactly.
I was just thinking about that. If people listening have not seen the remake of The Talented Mr. Ripley with, I think his name is Andrew Scott, urge you to do it. And the first episode's a little slow. Stick with it. It is every single shot is gorgeous.
Yeah, and that, I mean, I watched it because my wife was incredibly excited about it. It was like, you've got to watch this. And I'm not a fan of Andrew Scott, despite his name, as an actor. So I was a little bit trepidatious. But the moment I watched it, I started to think, yeah, of course. But at the same time, let's go and look at The Third Man. Let's go and look at all those great black and white and the French noir films. And, it takes you into this whole world of cinematography. The world is so visually rich, but you can't just look at making visual stories by looking at visuals. You have to have more depth to it.
The place where I get my story ideas is really by trying to be very sensitive to my own flickering emotions, something that might just come and go in a second. Like I did a book, and it was a visually driven book, but it wasn't necessarily a photo book some years ago, called Other People's Love Letters, which is a collection of love letters that I sort of asked other people for and reprinted them. And I got the idea for that because I found a love letter that somebody had left to my ex-wife when I was going to pick up my kids. There was a love letter that somebody had written to her on a table, which I knew I shouldn't read, but I read anyway. And the emotion I had around that, was very deep for me. And so that became a story that I wanted to explore. And I think, everybody has those little moments of curiosity and emotion. And I would just suggest writing them down. You may not have a visual to go with it right away, but write them down and come back to those emotions, because they're kind of a gold mine.
Yeah, and that idea of keeping a notebook for that stuff is great. But again, there you go. We're talking about the intellectual, we're talking about the emotional as these two different approaches, and they're both as valid as each other, but they are both feeding into. But, I get my ideas from everywhere. I mean, like, there isn't anything I don't watch or read. I'm just open to everything. And something just kind of connects, and I just think, yeah, actually, let's do that. I mean, I'm just photographing light in the corner of the room of our new house at the minute, because in the early morning, this light hits this corner, and every morning the shapes and the forms are different. It won't become anything, but it's just like sketching.
Right. So I asked Kate, what are some of the mistakes? I asked her, what are some of the mistakes that you see younger or newer photographers making when telling long form stories? And she says, I've seen so many photographers, new and experienced, treat the people they photograph without respect, use them. It's all about respect and being appreciative of the time they're giving you. Long form stories are about your relationship with who you're photographing. Bring them a little gift when they invite you to their house, the way you do with a friend who invited you over. Make them lots of prints. Always be transparent about the story you're working on and give them updates. Obviously, if you're working for the New York Times, then follow the paper's rules on conduct when you're photographing. But if it's your project, then you get to do what you think is appropriate in the situation. So that's really about relationships. And when you build a relationship, with your subject over time, you go deeper, and you start to understand different elements of their story.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we've spoken about empathy again and again.
Yes.
There's just no sense, no space for a sense of entitlement when you're telling a story. You're not telling your story, you're telling somebody else's story. And it's really important to understand that. It's not all about you.
Right, exactly. I did, when I went on Kate's website and looked around, I noticed that she sort of divides things by long stories and short stories. And then sometimes she refers to thing as being a series. And I asked her about that. And maybe it's just semantics, but she said, I do differentiate between a series and a story. Sometimes I'll collect a group of portraits or maybe candid street photographs, for example, and make a series. But it's not always a group of work from the same time and place like a story would be.
But it becomes a personal story because she's telling us the story of kind of the evolution of her portraiture.
Well, that's an interesting question. So is the story of how I work a story?
It's a story. So I think we need to use the word story in a very kind of fluid way. The idea that a story has to conform. I mean, you said at the beginning about kind of beginning, middle, and end, and I agree with you. But what about end, beginning, middle? What about playing around with that? What about the story being the story of a person's progression as a photographer and telling other people's stories? It could be the story of an inanimate object, for example. There's a great book called The Pillar, which I think I've mentioned before, which is just the story of a wooden stake in a field. This. I think the problem for me is that people get too hung up on the idea of what the story is without really opening themselves to what a story could be. And that's why I talk about poetry and I talk about music and I talk about, writing, creative writing, to get photographers out of this kind of box as to what they think a photography story is.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the idea, and in the show notes, let's post the story about the post in the field, because I think that's very instructive for people who think about storytelling only in a narrative way. I think this can kind of break that world wide open a little bit when you take a look at this and then consider how you could do something similar yourself.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've got so many photo books which are narrative based, but are quite loose in that way as to what the narrative is and the storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the story can be the emotion that you feel from the photographs rather than a distinct. These people met here and then they split up here and then got back together in the end here. The story can be less what you see from these pictures and more how you feel. So there's a lot of latitude here.
I think so. But I think also that point that what she was making about the Instagram is really, really relevant. It's something I want to just quickly address because I heard somebody recently saying that music today is all about the sound. It's not about the songs, it's about the sound. And if you think about that when you're listening to a lot of new popular music, it is the sound. Whereas if we go back through the history of songwriting, the narrative was the beginning point because the song was a point of communication, of telling stories for people who couldn't read. So, I think we have to be careful not to throw everything away just in search of the sound or the Instagram hit.
Yeah. Well, one photographer who I think you would probably agree is old school in a very successful way is named Dr. Greg Gulbranson. And I've mentioned Greg before here, but I spoke with him again because he is a self-taught photographer and something of a photography outsider. He's a pediatrician and an extraordinary storyteller. And he's got an incredible book coming out in August that's called Say Less.
Sorry, it's brilliant, Bill.
Yeah, I did send it to you because I'm so glad you think so. So the story is about a gang leader in the Bronx who ran his gang from his wheelchair because he was paralyzed from a bullet from a rival gang. And it's a book I know very well because I helped Greg make it and I wrote the text for it. But I think something that helps Greg as a storyteller is his job as a pediatrician, because people come to him and present with symptoms and he tries to intervene, and then there's an outcome. And he's used to asking them, when did this start? Then what happened? Then what happened? And his bedside manner combined with his intuitive sense of storytelling is extremely effective in this book. So I asked Greg how he finds his stories and what makes his spidey sense tingle. And he told me this: I've never really looked for any of the stories that I've shot. It's always been that while shooting around something else, all of a sudden new circumstances present themselves and bang. When Malik, who's the paralyzed gang leader, with Malik, I was following kids on bikes who were trying to avoid gangs and guns, which ultimately led to the story of this life and this man who had been a gunshot victim. He met a guy named Red, who's a young addict in the Bronx, when I was hanging out with Malik on the street, and he came up holding an armful of stolen clothes from the Gap. Bang, story. When I first met Malik, it was obvious to me there was a strong story here. As a pediatrician who cares for young people, and this is Greg talking here, who had accidentally killed his own son in a car accident, which is one of the tragedies that sort of comes through the photography in this book, which happened to Greg, unfortunately. He says, I could relate to the way Malik was dealing with tragedy. That experience has taught me that, for me, I need stories that resonate with me and offer a psychological connection, something that drives my fascination and gives me energy in order for me to drive long distances at off hours, tolerate bad weather, skip meals, live on the road, etc. I personally feel the best stories are told by photographers who are in the stories in some way. By in, I mean there was something in your life or personality that ties you into the story that you want to tell. I know photographers argue about this, but for me, that's what works best.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's not much more to say apart from go and buy that book.
Well, that's great. And we'll put a link in the show notes. But I think this idea of something in the story that you're shooting resonates with you on some level, that really speaks to you, that's something that you want to excavate in yourself, I think really can feed the interest that you need to sustain a long-term and deep project.
Yeah, you've got to have that personal connection. And I think this is where, if we go back to that question at the beginning of the episode, I think the difficulty that photographer with their approach is they're trying to create something without kind of putting in the groundwork. And it's a bit like trying to build something. You've got to build the foundations, and those foundations come from connection, but they come from research, they come from listening. And in fact, they come from a whole load of different places that have got nothing to do with a camera.
Yeah. And I think, as a journalist, as a text writer, the first thing you're taught is to think about and ask who, what, where, when, and how. And part of that is basic information. You need to have that in any kind of story. But part of it is also starting to think with a more empathetic mind, not just how does this look to you, but look at this story from multiple different perspectives. So you may think it started, when in this case, Malik got shot and paralyzed, but in fact, there's something that led him to be in that situation from the beginning, poverty, structural racism, his family, whatever it is, and to be sensitive to the multiple places where a story can begin, I think is important as well.
I think it's essential. In fact, when I teach, I often refer to that as connected thinking. So the idea is that the deeper that you investigate an idea you have, the more chance of it actually succeeding. So as well as who, where, when, but add to that why, how. And
right.
by asking those questions, you're going to get answers that are going to take you in a different direction. And you may well end up a long way from your original idea, but it will have gone through rigorous investigation rather than saying, I've got an idea, I'm going to go and do it. Well, yeah, fine, but you're really opening yourself up to not very much success or depth in whatever it is that you come up with.
Yeah, and I think that if you're shooting a cake or if you are shooting, a sexy fashion shot, even if that shot is a single image, to think about, well, why is that cake here? Why is that person here? Why is she dressed like that? And to create some story in your head that's interesting to you and emotionally dynamic to you. I think will help with the shooting of the story, even if that doesn't necessarily come through in a series of pictures like a narrative. But to start to put some story narrative framework on this, I think will help in the shooting.
Yeah, it's absolutely essential, as we know. I mean, we were talking about journalism and photography recently, weren't we? And, I'm increasingly finding myself drawn towards, I suppose, what I'm thinking about as being 21st century journalism. And once again, not sticking to the old rules or kind of format of journalism, but being much looser about those kind of intersections where visual journalism joins with written journalism, and photography is as much part of communication as the written word.
Absolutely. I asked Greg about how he comes to define the story and what elements he includes. And this is what he told me. The elements of a story, to me, are studying my subjects deeply at all hours of the day and night, and including all of that. If they have family members, then include those relationships. If they have a career or hobby, follow that too. Look for their struggles and look for their interests. It's not fair to leave anything out. Be truthful and as unbiased as possible. You are obligated to tell their story accurately, not your interpretation of their story. Be patient, as it's never easy.
That's perfect advice, isn't it?
Yeah, and I love the idea about, if you're going into something thinking that you sort of have a sense of what the story is, and it's about this guy's struggle, et cetera, not to include the fact that he loves making model airplanes or whatever it is. And, maybe you think your story is a sort of a sad or tragic story, but to find those places in this person's life where there is joy and interest and passion, you kind of have to do that. And that's what makes a story three-dimensional.
So really what we're saying to our listener at the beginning there is, yes, storytelling is really important. However, don't sort of leap in there thinking you know the story before you've had an opportunity to find the story.
Right. And, as I have found so many times, sometimes the story that you think you want to tell is nowhere near as good as the story that you come to once you peel a layer or two away.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
be open to that. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be. I mean, I'm writing a book based on fact, which is exactly that at the minute, and it's like my next book. But it's already taken twice as long as my usual books take, just because it's taken me in so many interesting directions. Now, listen, Bill, we haven't got a lot of time this week, so would you like to fit in the last person you spoke to,
yes,
or do you want to save it for the next one? What do you want to do?
No, I mean, I think I'll do it right now because it is kind of a counter argument to some of the stuff we've talking about in a way. Or a different emphasis. Let me put it that way. So Keith Cullen is the person I spoke with. He's the founder of Setanta Books, an online seller of rare and new photo books. And they also publish 6 to 8 photo books a year. They're based in London. They're terrific books. I asked Keith, why do you think it's important for young or emerging photographers to learn to tell stories as opposed to make beautiful single images? Or perhaps you don't think this, and if not, why? He says, I do agree that a narrative works well for photo books, but it's not so important for us. Having a photographer try to frame a series of images with a narrative that isn't strong is worse than not having one at all, which I agree with. I then asked him, when you're looking at and evaluating photo stories for a book, what are a couple things that you look for? Like, what are the ingredients that make you say, yeah, this is a place where I want to spend some time, or this is a story I want to help tell? And his answer was interesting. He said, to be honest with you, I pay a lot of attention to their social media profile and their ability to market themselves. Photographers tend to be insular by nature, and selling photo books is not easy. So if you're going to take a financial risk by publishing someone's book, and I do think it's possible to do this as a sign of commitment to the work, then we need the photographer to be prepared to sell themselves and their work. So I went to him asking about story, and what he came back to me with was the ability to sell your story and to promote your story.
Do you know what, Bill? I find that absolutely fascinating, and it's something I would really like to talk about in our next episode, because I think that opens up a whole area of discussion, which is kind of separate in a sense, because there's so much I could say about that.
Okay, well let's sidebar that, and we'll do it next time. And then I'll just read the last question that I asked him. I asked Keith, what are some of the mistakes that you see younger and newer photographers make when telling long form stories? And he says, to continue with my last point, I guess over or underselling themselves. But with respect to telling a story, there are a lot of stories that get repeated or that people hone in on, and it's important for it to have a different angle. And again, it's important for the photographer to realize that if someone like Setanta or other publishers are going to take their project on board, the photographer has to make it easy and not be too long-winded and indulgent. As Alex Soft once said in a video, how big is your market? If it's small, then self-publish and don't assume that any publisher has a magic audience for you.
Right. He's going at 1,000,000 miles an hour at the minute.
Yeah, I'll read the last one, which is very short, and then we can circle back or hold it for next week. The last question I asked Keith was about what makes a good photo story for a book, as opposed to, say, a long form magazine story. And he said, I guess the answer to this is that space available for the long-term magazine story is disappearing. So the photo book is the next best vehicle.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with that. Obviously, I mean, exhibitions and photo books and self-published photo books are where we are now, aren't we? I mean, it's. I don't know if you heard the conversation I had recently with Fiona Hayes on the podcast, where we spoke about the idea of actually what is a magazine, what is a journal, and what is a book.
Yep.
She's paying £25 now for a magazine. Which she considers to be a magazine, which we have quite a discussion around. So actually the vehicle that you release that in is interesting, isn't it? It's the difference between, I know I always go back to music, but I'm going to do it. It's the difference between going back to a vinyl album and the experience of listening to it there, or streaming it onto your phone. There you've got the photo book and you've got Instagram.
Right.
So I think he's raised some really interesting points there, and I think you're right. It's very interesting to hear the publisher's perspective on those questions.
Yeah, and I guess if we go meta on this, the reason why I talked to two photographers and then a publisher is because I thought it would make a better story to come at this from a few different angles, and so. The fact that he is focused on other aspects, I found really interesting and kind of crucial for photographers to know.
I think so, but I think it's from my perspective, I don't know if you agree, but I think it's another aspect of the conversation for us to delve into.
I'm ready.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Bill, as always, we have covered some ground this month in this episode.
We have, and I think the moral of the story for me, again, these great topics come from our listeners. So please feel free to reach out to Grant, to reach out to me, and send us anything that's on your mind and that you're thinking about.
Yeah, that would be great. How do they get in touch with you, Bill?
On Instagram, I'm at Bill Shapiro, and you can DM me.
And you can get hold of me through the United Nations of Photography.com website. Just go for the contact and it emails straight through to me. So 2 easy ways to get hold of us. We're also on Threads. And are you still on Twitter, Bill?
Not really. I gave it up because I don't like the guy who runs it.
No, there was a nasty smell, wasn't there? I left for the same reason. Bill, as always, there's just so much. We could go on for days about this, but we do try and keep these conversations relatively concise. So thank you once again for all of your hard work. Thank you for everybody who contributed there, Bill. Really great contributions from the people you spoke to.
Yes, and their information will be in the show notes, so you can follow them and hear more from them at your leisure. Thanks so much, Grant. Always fun.
No, it's great, Bill. Honestly, I'm so excited about the next episode.
As am I. I will speak to you soon.
Take care. Cheers. Bye. I hope you enjoyed this particular episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, never forget to take care.